The slap echoed sharply through the otherwise quiet first-class cabin. All conversation stopped. The gentle clinking of glasses, the soft rustling of magazines, everything froze. Every pair of eyes turned towards seat 1A. Some passengers raised their eyebrows, others exchanged quick glances, and a few simply pressed their lips together. But it was clear. They were all waiting for the situation to explode. Olivia Parker stood rooted to the spot. Her hands still lingered in the air, fingers slightly numb, palm burning hot from the slap she had just delivered to the woman in front of her. Her heart pounded, breaths coming in shallow bursts, though she fought hard to mask her unease. She wanted to maintain the composure and authority she had perfected over 12 years as lead flight attendant in first class. But deep down, Olivia knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The woman who had been slapped, Alexis Morgan, remained still. She calmly set her glass of water down on the small table beside her, then adjusted the lapel of her simple gray blazer. Her short hair framed her angular face, and her deep brown skin seemed to glow under the warm cabin lighting. Alexis said nothing. She simply lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Olivia. There was calmness in her eyes, but also a sharpness, like the edge of a blade. It made Olivia feel as though she had just stepped into dangerous territory. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but to Olivia it stretched into an eternity. She felt every tick of the clock press heavily against her chest. Before she could say anything, a man sitting nearby broke the silence with a hushed but firm voice. "What's going on here?" Olivia inhaled deeply, summoning her practiced professional tone. "Nothing, sir. Just a small misunderstanding." But she knew better than anyone. This was far from a small misunderstanding, and what had just unfolded would not be easily forgotten. It all started over an hour earlier when the first-class passengers were boarding. Olivia had always taken pride in her ability to read people. With just a glance, she could tell who was a regular in first class, who had been upgraded for the first time, and who was trying too hard to look like they belonged. The truly wealthy carried themselves with a certain ease, sometimes even indifference because luxury was their norm. The ones pretending? They always gave themselves away, and Olivia could always tell. But when Alexis Morgan entered the cabin, something felt off. The woman was calm, too calm. No excitement, no impatience, no curious glances around like someone experiencing first class for the first time. She simply placed her bag in the overhead compartment, took her seat in 1A, and opened a magazine as though this were just another day. But it was precisely that ease that caught Olivia's attention. Seeing a black woman in first class wasn't unusual, but typically they were celebrities, singers, actresses, or the wives of executives. They arrived glammed up, makeup flawless, designer bags in hand, wearing Hermes or Louis Vuitton. Alexis was different. Her outfit was neat but plain, no logos, no flashy jewelry. The watch on her wrist wasn't dripping in diamonds. It was understated, elegant, the kind worn by someone who understood true value. That made Olivia suspicious. This woman didn't seem to belong, at least not in Olivia's eyes. Once the flight had reached cruising altitude, Olivia decided to act. She approached seat 1A with her most polished professional smile. "Excuse me, ma'am. I just need to confirm your boarding pass." Alexis didn't seem surprised. She calmly handed over the ticket. It checked everything was in order. But Olivia wasn't satisfied. A few minutes later, she returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'll need to see your ID." This time, a few nearby passengers took notice. But Alexis remained unbothered. She took out her wallet and handed over her identification. Name matched. Photo matched. Everything was correct. But Olivia still couldn't let it go. Something gnawed at her. She leaned over to Natalie Brown, a younger colleague. "There's something off about the woman in 1A, Olivia whispered. Natalie shrugged. "Her ticket's fine. Her ID's fine. You're overthinking it." But Olivia didn't believe that. She contacted the ground crew for a further check. The result came back the same. Everything was legitimate. Yet deep down, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her instincts, sharpened over more than a decade, had been right before, and this time she was sure they were right again. The final straw came when Olivia noticed Alexis typing on her phone. A surge of anxiety hit her. She needed to act. She moved in quickly, her voice sharper than intended. "Excuse me, ma'am. Who are you messaging?" Alexis looked up, her eyes colder now. That's my personal business. You're overstepping. Those words lit a fuse in Olivia's chest. She felt challenged, undermined, in front of the passengers. In a brief moment of lost control, she raised her hand. The slap landed, and that was the moment everything began to fall apart. Olivia froze. The slap had been like a wake-up call, but it was too late to take it back. The eyes on her grew heavier with judgment. Some passengers began whispering among themselves, others averted their gaze, pretending not to see, though their curiosity was obvious. The air in first class thickened. Every breath seemed laced with condemnation. Olivia felt herself spiraling. She had crossed a line. She knew it. But now, there was no way back. Alexis Morgan remained still. Her slender hands slowly rose to her cheek, where the red imprint of Olivia's fingers was starting to form. Her eyes didn't well up with tears. She wasn't angry, nor did she appear hurt. She was simply calm, eerily so. And that was what made Olivia even more uneasy. She braced herself for a reaction, a burst of outrage, or at least a loud complaint. But none came. Alexis just stared at her with eyes that seemed to say, "I've seen everything I need to see, and you will pay for this." Olivia opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. She tried to cling to whatever authority she had left. "Are you all right, ma'am? I apologize for my loss of control," Olivia stammered, her voice low but loud enough for a few passengers to hear. Alexis didn't respond. She held Olivia's gaze for a few more seconds, then casually shifted in her seat, crossed her legs, and leaned back, like nothing had happened. But Olivia knew. It wasn't over. As soon as Olivia turned toward the galley, Natalie Brown rushed over, eyes wide with panic. "Olivia, what the hell was that? Did you just slap a passenger? Are you crazy?" Natalie whispered, voice trembling. "She provoked me," Olivia replied, though she knew how weak that sounded, even to herself. She's not a normal passenger." Natalie frowned. "I don't care who she is. You can't do that. You need to report this to the captain. Now." Olivia knew Natalie was right, but guilt, mixed with pride, made her hesitate. She didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want Captain James Wilson to know she had let her emotions derail her professionalism, something unforgivable for a lead flight attendant. But she had no choice. Olivia made her way toward the cockpit. Her steps were quick, but her heart felt heavier with every stride. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A few moments later, Captain Wilson opened it. His face was calm, but his eyes sharpened as he noticed her tension. "What is it, Olivia?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had seen it all in his decades of flying. Olivia swallowed hard. "I had an incident with a passenger. I lost my temper and acted inappropriately." Wilson's brow furrowed. "Who?" "The passenger in 1A, Alexis Morgan." The name made Wilson freeze. His expression shifted. The calmness vanished, replaced by sharp caution. He glanced over at the first officer, then turned his full attention back to Olivia. "Are you certain? Alexis Morgan?" His tone was suddenly clipped, edged with concern. A cold rush shot through Olivia's veins. Fear crept up her spine. "Yes, I believe so. I checked her ID and boarding pass. That's the name." Wilson turned back into the cockpit and swiftly pulled up the internal system. He typed in the name Alexis Morgan. A few seconds later, bold red letters flashed across the screen. "Access restricted, VIP priority." Wilson let out a low hiss through his teeth. He understood. And now, Olivia did too. Her heart nearly stopped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Wilson's voice was cold, cutting through the air like ice. "She's not just a passenger. She's the chairwoman of Morgan Airways. She owns a significant stake in our airline." Olivia felt her legs weaken beneath her. The world around her seemed to tilt. Chairwoman? The woman she had just slapped was the owner of the airline she worked for? Captain Wilson picked up the intercom phone, his tone firm and resolute. "I'll notify the company. Security will escort you upon landing." Olivia stood frozen. Those words hit her like a death sentence. Everything she had worked for, years of dedication, the climb to lead flight attendant, it was all about to crumble over one moment of lost control. "Captain, please, can I apologize to her? I'll do anything," Olivia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, bordering on begging. Wilson sighed, his face hard. "You'll apologize, but not privately. You'll do it in front of the entire first-class cabin. That's an order." Her face burned with shame. A public apology right in front of every passenger who had witnessed her mistake, something she had never even imagined having to do in her career. But there was no choice. Olivia turned and made her way back to the cabin, her mind spinning. The eyes were still there, judging, curious, some irritated. And Alexis Morgan, the woman she had struck, remained seated, calm and composed, as though she held Olivia's future in the palm of her hand. Stopping at seat 1A, Olivia felt her chest tighten. The murmurs died down. Everyone knew something was about to happen. She inhaled deeply, then bowed slightly. Mrs. Morgan, I apologize for my rude and unprofessional behavior. I was wrong. I sincerely hope you can forgive me. Silence blanketed the cabin. Everyone was holding their breath. Alexis slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes were still calm, but carried a power that made Olivia feel small. Why did you think I didn't belong here? Alexis asked, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the air. The question sliced through Olivia's pride like a blade. She knew the answer, but to say it out loud, here, before everyone, was the hardest part. Olivia's voice wavered, but she spoke the truth. Because I judged you by your appearance, and I was wrong. Alexis held her gaze for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, she turned back to her magazine. Olivia stepped back, her body drained. She had apologized, but she knew the worst was still to come. She returned to the rear galley, her legs heavy with shame and dread. Every step felt like dragging a weight behind her. She didn't dare look up, but she could feel the eyes tracking her every move. Every whispered conversation seemed amplified in her ears, like verdicts being passed on her. Natalie was waiting at the drink station, concern etched on her face. How did it go? She asked quietly, her voice a mix of sympathy and tension. Olivia shook her head, unable to form words. She turned on the water tap, filled a glass with cold water, and took a sip. But as the water touched her lips, nausea twisted her stomach. Natalie gently squeezed Olivia's shoulder. You apologized. She didn't blow up on you. Maybe it'll be okay. Olivia appreciated the effort to comfort her, but she knew better. A regular passenger might let it go, but Alexis Morgan, a billionaire, the chairwoman of the airline, a public slap wasn't something that could simply be washed away with a polite apology. The intercom phone rang suddenly. Olivia flinched. Natalie picked it up. After a brief exchange, she turned back, eyes wide. The captain wants you back in the cockpit, right now. Olivia's heart skipped. She straightened her uniform, trying to steady her breathing. She made her way to the front of the plane, each step feeling like the march toward a final judgment. The feeling in her chest was unmistakable. This could very well be the end. Captain Wilson was waiting at the cockpit door. He no longer wore that cold, stern expression, but the tension on his face was unmistakable. Mrs. Morgan has contacted the executives, he said, his voice low. Your name has been forwarded directly to the company's disciplinary board. Olivia felt like lightning had struck her out of a clear sky. She had braced herself for the worst, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach drop. Am I going to be fired? She stammered, her throat dry. Wilson didn't answer right away. I don't know, but you will definitely be suspended pending an investigation. He paused, then looked her in the eyes. But that's not what concerns me the most right now. Olivia blinked. What could be worse than losing the job she had built her entire life around? Mrs. Morgan, she's very private, but she's also extremely powerful. Once she marks someone, the entire airline industry can close its doors to that person, Wilson said, his voice dropping lower. What I'm saying is, if she wants to, you won't just lose this job. You'll never work as a flight attendant again. Anywhere. A shiver ran through Olivia's body. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was the end of a dream, a career, and possibly the dignity she had protected for so many years. Is there anything I can do to make this right? She asked, her voice trembling with desperation. Wilson looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. I don't know, Olivia. This is beyond me. Only she can decide. Returning to the first-class cabin, Olivia felt like a ship adrift in an endless sea. She quietly positioned herself behind the beverage station, her eyes drawn again and again to seat 1A. Alexis Morgan was still there, occasionally looking out the window, other times calmly scrolling through her phone. Her demeanor hadn't changed, graceful, composed, yet radiating authority. An older male passenger, clearly a businessman, gestured for a refill of his wine. As Olivia leaned forward to pour, he spoke quietly, just for her to hear. You did what no one dares to do here, but you took a hell of a risk. His tone wasn't mocking, it carried a subtle warning. Olivia pressed her lips together and gave a slight nod of thanks before retreating back to the galley. She knew. Her only hope now lay with Alexis Morgan. The evening dragged on. Every minute felt stretched beyond reason. Olivia had never endured a flight that felt this long. Each time she passed 1A, her heart raced, but Alexis neither summoned her nor acknowledged her presence. That silence terrified Olivia more than any confrontation. As the flight neared its descent, Olivia knew she had to do something. Anything. She prepared a cup of hot tea with lemon and carefully carried it to Alexis. She bowed slightly as she set the tray down. Mrs. Morgan, I know my apology earlier may not have been enough. I deeply regret my actions. I only ask that you give me a chance to prove I can be better, Olivia said, her voice sincere, trembling with raw emotion. Alexis looked up at her. Once more, those eyes pierced into Olivia's soul. But this time, there was something different. The icy exterior had softened. There was now consideration in her gaze. She lifted the teacup, stirred it gently, and then spoke. Her voice was calm but resolute. I don't need you to prove anything to me. I need you to prove it to yourself. Olivia froze. The words cut deep, yet they also unlocked something, an exit from the abyss she had fallen into. Thank you so much, Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. Alexis gave the faintest smile, a subtle gesture of acceptance. And for Olivia, it was the first glimmer of light after a day shrouded in darkness. But she knew, even with forgiveness, what had happened would remain a lesson etched into her memory for the rest of her life. The moment the plane touched down on the runway, Olivia felt like a weight had been lifted, if only slightly, from her chest. Every hour of that flight had stretched endlessly. She had felt the burden of every glance, every breath, and above all, the quiet dominance of Alexis Morgan. Her poise, her power without words, that was more intimidating than any threat. Even with that small smile of acknowledgement, Olivia couldn't be sure she had truly been forgiven. People like Alexis, those sitting so high up that they could decide the fate of hundreds, thousands of employees, did not need to show their emotions. They only needed to make a decision. And that decision could erase someone's career as if they had never existed. Olivia knew this better than anyone. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom, announcing the arrival at Gate 12. The first-class passengers began gathering their belongings. Some switched on their phones, checked emails, arranged transportation, or texted loved ones. Everything appeared normal, as if nothing had happened. But Olivia knew that, for her, nothing had been normal since the slap. Alexis Morgan remained seated. She was in no rush. She was never in a rush. Even as others stood and filed out, she calmly turned a page in her magazine before finally closing it and placing it into her bag with deliberate ease. Olivia stood near the front of the cabin, her eyes drawn to Alexis. She knew she shouldn't approach again, but there was an invisible string pulling her gaze toward the woman who held her future in her hands. Natalie nudged her elbow gently. You okay? Olivia gave a small nod, but inside she wasn't okay. When Alexis finally reached the aircraft door, Olivia instinctively tilted her head slightly, a reflex born from years of training. The professional smile, the polite nod, the standard farewell. Thank you for flying with us. Have a wonderful day. Alexis paused just for a beat. Her eyes met Olivia's one last time. It wasn't the gaze of power or judgment. It was the look of someone who had seen everything, someone wise enough to know that no one is perfect. Thank you, Alexis said, her voice low and smooth. You did well, in the end. Olivia held her breath. It might have been just politeness, but to her, those words were a sliver of hope, a crack in the door, offering her the chance to pull herself back from the brink. As Alexis disappeared into the flow of passengers, Olivia realized her heart was racing. For the first time in hours, her legs felt lighter. But this was only the beginning. She knew the road ahead would still be long and uncertain. That afternoon, after the aircraft had been cleaned and prepped for the next flight, Olivia received a call from Human Resources. She had expected it, but when she saw the internal extension on her screen, her hands still trembled. The voice on the other end belonged to Mary Collins, the head of HR, a woman whose stern reputation was known across the airline. Olivia, we've received the report about today's incident. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning to go over a few details? Collins's tone was not angry, nor was it sympathetic. It was precise, cold in the way that only someone who held power over careers could be. Olivia knew what this was. Tomorrow's meeting would be the first hearing to determine whether she still had a future with the airline. "I'll be there, ma'am," Olivia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. After hanging up, Olivia slumped into a chair in the crew lounge. Her mind was blank. Everything had happened so fast, so violently. She felt like she had lost something deeply important, but at the same time, she realized there was still a chance to reclaim it. That chance depended entirely on her attitude moving forward. Natalie approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside Olivia and placed 1 cup in front of her. "You know, I think she gave you a way out," Natalie said softly. Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" "I noticed when Mrs. Morgan was leaving, she looked at you differently. That wasn't the look of someone who's going to bury you. That was someone waiting to see if you'll change." Olivia didn't respond right away. She took a sip of coffee. It was bitter, but warm. At the very least, it made her feel a little more grounded. "Maybe you're right," she exhaled, "but still, you saw me hit rock bottom today." The two of them laughed, tension still lingering underneath, but it was laughter nonetheless. It was the first real moment of relief after a day that had been nothing short of disastrous. That night, back in her small apartment, Olivia sat in front of her mirror for a long time. She studied her reflection, the face of a 35-year-old woman who had once believed she had everything figured out. Now she looked tired, vulnerable. But there was something new in her eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. Caution, humility, and an awareness that every person she encountered carried a story she could never fully understand. Before going to bed, she picked up her phone and typed in the name Alexis Morgan. Articles about the billionaire flooded the screen, her power, her deals, her dominance in the airline industry. But amidst all the business headlines, Olivia found a photo from a charity event. There was Alexis, standing among a group of underprivileged black children in the city's poorest neighborhood. Her smile was radiant, genuine, a far cry from the composed, steely woman in seat 1A. Olivia stared at that photo for a long time. When she finally turned off the lights and lay in bed, she realized the gift she had received. It wasn't just a chance to keep her job, it was a chance to become a better person. The kind of person Alexis Morgan had quietly given her the opportunity to become. The next morning, Olivia Parker woke up earlier than usual. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window as the soft morning light crept through the thin curtains. Her mind was still replaying every detail from the flight, every glance, every word, and the slap that had put her entire career in jeopardy. She let out a deep sigh and slowly got up. Her reflection in the mirror showed a tired face, but there was determination in her eyes. Today, she would face the human resources meeting, the one that could decide her future in just a few sentences. Olivia chose a modest yet professional outfit. Not her flight attendant uniform, because today she wasn't showing up as a crew member serving passengers. She was showing up as someone who had to answer for a serious mistake. Buttoning her blouse, she took a deep breath and told herself, "Whatever happens, I'll face it." The journey from her apartment to the airline's headquarters felt longer than ever. It wasn't the traffic, it was her mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Would she be fired? Or worse, blacklisted from the entire industry? Would this be the end of the career she loved? When Olivia stepped into the towering glass building, her heartbeat quickened. Her colleagues passed by, some greeting her with polite nods, oblivious to what had happened the day before. That gave her a brief sense of relief, but also dread. The incident hadn't spread, but it had reached the people who mattered, the ones who held her future in their hands. The conference room was already occupied by 4 people: Mary Collins, the stern head of human resources, George Hayes, the airline's operations director, a company legal representative, and Captain James Wilson. Wilson gave Olivia a small, reassuring smile, as if to say he was there to ensure fairness, not to see her fall. "Take a seat, Olivia," Collins said, her tone firm but not hostile. Olivia felt a slight comfort in that. She pulled out a chair and sat down, gripping her knees lightly to steady herself. "We've received a detailed report from Captain Wilson regarding the incident on yesterday's flight," Collins began. We've also spoken with Mrs. Alexis Morgan. Before we make any decisions, I'd like to hear your version of what happened. Olivia took a deep breath. This was it, the most critical moment. She couldn't let her pride or emotions cloud her words. First and foremost, I take full responsibility for my actions, Olivia said, her voice steady but careful. I allowed my personal biases and assumptions to cloud my judgment, leading to a serious lapse in professionalism. I have no excuse. I deeply regret what I did. Collins gave a small nod, but her expression remained neutral. Do you understand who you slapped? After the incident, I found out she's the chairwoman of Morgan Airways and a major shareholder in our airline, Olivia answered, her voice catching on the final words. Do you understand that your actions didn't just affect you personally? They could have severely damaged the company's reputation, George Hayes interjected, his tone calm but heavy with authority. I understand, and I'm willing to accept any disciplinary action, Olivia said, meeting Hayes's gaze directly. The room fell into a brief silence. Collins flipped through a few papers, then looked back up at Olivia. Mrs. Morgan contacted us shortly after the flight, Collins said. She gave a full account of what happened, but she also said she does not want you to be fired. Olivia's head shot up. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She could barely process what she had just heard. Mrs. Morgan believes everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether you learn from them. She believes you've learned your lesson, Collins continued. However, that does not mean you won't face consequences. Olivia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude, though she braced herself for whatever punishment would come. We've decided to suspend you for 1 month, Collins said firmly. You'll also be required to complete specialized training on customer service and handling sensitive situations. After that, you may return to work, but you will be closely monitored for 3 months. A lump formed in Olivia's throat. It was a harsh penalty, but compared to losing her job or her entire career, it was the second chance she had been hoping for. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll do everything I can to make this right, Olivia said, her voice trembling with emotion. The meeting concluded. As Olivia stepped out into the hallway, she paused for a moment to take a deep breath. The weight she had carried for days seemed to lift, partially, but she knew this was just the beginning of a new journey, one where she would have to learn to see people with understanding, not judgment. That afternoon, as Olivia left the headquarters, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I hope you make the most of this opportunity. I believe you will. A.M. Olivia smiled softly. A.M. Alexis Morgan. She looked up at the clear blue sky, watching the gentle curves of planes cutting through the clouds. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed she could still fly, this time with eyes that truly saw the world around her. The days following her suspension felt like a delicate balancing act between grief and gratitude. Olivia knew she had hit rock bottom, but she also knew she had been handed a lifeline, and that lifeline had a name: Alexis Morgan. What could have felt like a punishment became something different for Olivia, a pause, a chance to reflect. For 12 years, she had believed she was sharp, skilled at reading people, an expert at assessing others with precision. But her pride had blinded her. She had let unconscious bias creep into her instincts like a thin layer of dust, subtle but distorting everything she thought she saw. Each morning during her suspension, Olivia no longer rushed into her uniform. Instead, she read books on empathy, on human behavior, on racial bias and discrimination. She devoured stories of those who had fought to break barriers. She read about Alexis Morgan, a black billionaire who had risen from poverty, once working as a janitor in an airport to chase her dream of flying. Every page, every story felt like a slap to Olivia's pride. She realized how small and naive her view of the world had been. The airline's special training course was far from the dull lectures Olivia had expected. It was open, raw, an environment where flight attendants like her were encouraged to confront their hidden biases. Some admitted they had always assumed black passengers were more likely to complain. Others confessed they often believed that middle-aged women in simple clothes were probably flying on a free upgrade, never truly wealthy. Olivia listened to every story, and for the first time, she faced herself honestly. During one session, the instructor posed a question that pierced through her like a blade. If the woman in seat 1A had been white, wearing the exact same outfit, would you have checked her documents twice? Would you have slapped her? Olivia was silent. That question burrowed into her chest, cutting deeper than any punishment she had received. She knew the answer, and it hurt. When her suspension ended, Olivia returned to work. Slipping back into her blue uniform felt strange, almost foreign. She stood before the mirror and saw a familiar face, but there was something different in her eyes. She was still that 35-year-old woman, but now her gaze held a softness, a humility. Her first flight back, fatefully, was in first class. Olivia's heart pounded as she stepped into the cabin. Seat 1A was there, and every time her eyes passed over it, she saw the ghost of that moment. The raised hand, the calm stare of Alexis Morgan. The flight was smooth, free of incidents. But Olivia knew she was working differently now. When she served an older man wearing faded jeans and a wrinkled shirt, she didn't judge him. When a young black woman asked to swap her orange juice because it was too sour, Olivia simply smiled and brought a new one. Without thinking, here we go again. She realized that serving others with empathy and respect didn't just make her a better flight attendant, it made the job easier, lighter. A month later, after the last flight of a long day, Olivia found a handwritten letter tucked among her papers. In this digital age, it felt out of place. There was no name on the envelope. Curious, she opened it. The neat handwriting read, "Dear Olivia Parker, I heard you've returned to work. I believe that sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest growth. I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I also know you chose to face it and to change. I hope that the next time we meet in the skies, I'll be served by an Olivia Parker who is not only excellent at her job, but also someone who truly values every person in every seat. Fly high and far. Alexis Morgan." Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading. Her eyes burned and her throat tightened. Like this wasn't just a letter. It was forgiveness. It was a message of belief, a challenge to be better. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket, close to her heart. That night, for the first time in months, Olivia slept soundly. In her dreams, she stood beneath an endless sky. No judgment, no quick assumptions, just her, the clouds, and people of all colors and backgrounds, all flying together toward the sun.